picture the most revered international peace icon you can possibly imagine. Like someone who spent decades locked inside their own home, sacrificing their freedom.
Right, and their family, too.
Exactly, their family, their normal life, all of it, just to fight for democracy. Someone the world basically agreed was a living saint, placing her in the exact same breath as Nelson Mandela or Mahatma Gandhi.
Yeah, a total global icon.
Right. But now, imagine that very same person standing in front of the International Court of Justice, using her immense global platform to defend her country's military against accusations of genocide.
It's a massive pivot.
It really is. And then as the ultimate kind of tragic punchline to all of this, imagine that exact same military overthrowing her and just throwing her right back into prison.
I mean, if you pitched that as a Hollywood script, it would get rejected for being way too unrealistic. Like, it's too on the nose. But that is the actual documented trajectory of Aung San Suu Kyi. And for today's deep dive, we're basing this on a massive stack of historical accounts, international court records, and some really extensive biographies we've compiled from the sources. We're going to trace this totally unbelievable rise, her highly controversial fall from grace, and her really tragic return to captivity.
Yeah, and for you listening, this story is absolutely essential because it completely dismantles the myth of the perfect, flawless hero. It's basically a masterclass in the brutal realities of political power, the cost of compromise, and what happens when towering ideals inevitably crash into the messy reality of actually governing. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Because we desperately want our historical figures to be these one-dimensional saints, right? We want a clear-cut good guy and a clear-cut bad guy. But the reality we found in these sources is just so much more complicated.
Oh, absolutely. And to really understand how she ended up on trial at The Hague or, isolated in a prison cell by a military junta today, we have to start at the very beginning. We have to look at the immense, almost crushing weight of her name.
All right, the name itself is huge. She was born in 1945 in Rangoon, Burma, which of course we now know as Yangon, Myanmar. Her father was Aung San. And calling him the father of the nation isn't like an exaggeration or a metaphor.
No, not at all. He literally founded the modern Burmese army. And he was the key figure who negotiated the country's independence from the British back in 1947.
But then he was assassinated.
Exactly. He was assassinated by political rivals that exact same year when she was barely 2 years old.
Wow, just 2.
Yeah, and that assassination leaves this massive vacuum in the country's psyche. His name becomes almost mythical. But the thing is, despite growing up in that massive historical shadow, she didn't initially step into the political arena at all.
Right, she lived a surprisingly quiet life.
Very quiet and highly international. She was educated in India, then went to St. Hugh's College at Oxford. She lived in New York working for the UN on budget matters, actually.
Really? Budget matters?
Yeah, very behind-the-scenes stuff. And eventually, she married Michael Heiress, who is a British scholar of Tibetan culture, and they had 2 sons, Alexander and Kim.
So by all accounts, she was living the life of an academic and a mother in the UK.
Yeah.
I mean, looking at the sources, there's absolutely no early master plan to go overthrow a government.
None.
But then we hit this insane turning point. In 1988, she returns to Burma simply to care for her mother, who was very ill. And purely by coincidence-like historical accident, this is the exact moment the country just explodes into revolution.
The timing is incredible.
It is. It's known as the 88-88 Uprising, named because it reached its boiling point on August 8, 1988. The military dictator at the time, General Ne Win, who had basically driven the country into economic ruin, he steps down and the streets are just instantly filled with massive pro-democracy protests.
Right, hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah, and suddenly she goes from being a visiting daughter to standing at the Shwedagon Pagoda addressing 500,000 people and co-founding a brand new political party called the National League for Democracy, or NLD.
I mean, it is one of the most profound historical pivots of the 20th century. She arrives as a nurse to her mother and almost instantly becomes the face of a national uprising.
I'm really trying to wrap my head around that pivot, though. Like, did she just look out the window at the protest and decide, hey, I'm going to lead this? Or was the sheer gravity of her father's legacy basically a black hole that the people forced onto her?
It was really a powerful combination of both. But you have to understand the mechanics of why she resonated so deeply with the Burmese public right then. The people were desperate.
Desperate for a leader.
Exactly. A unifying figure to rally around after decades of authoritarian rule. And her name itself, Aung San, carried her father's historical authority. But, it wasn't just her bloodline.
She had the skills, too.
She did. She was incredibly eloquent. She managed to synthesize her father's legacy with a deep understanding of Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence. And she heavily layered that with Buddhist concepts that the majority of the country deeply understood and respected.
So she was kind of the perfect storm.
She became the pristine vessel for a democratic movement that the military had spent decades trying to crush.
Which, of course, made her an immediate existential threat to the new military junta that seized power in September 1988.
Yeah.
They couldn't just have this charismatic, unifying figure walking around organizing people, so they lock her up.
Yeah, they had to stop her.
And this begins the defining era of her life, right? Becoming one of the world's most famous political prisoners.
Yeah. Between 1989 and 2010, she spent 15 out of those 21 years under house arrest. The junta was completely terrified of her popularity, and honestly, they had really good reason to be.
Because of the election.
Exactly. In 1990, the military actually held a general election. They likely thought they had enough control to win and legitimize their rule globally, but instead, her party, the NLD, won 81% of the parliamentary seats. It was an absolute landslide.
But the military just nullified the results. They just said nope and refused to hand over power. And her ongoing detention is really what sparked massive international outrage. Like, in 1991, she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. But because she was locked away, her sons had to accept it in Europe on her behalf.
Right. And the international community really rallied around her because of her steadfast commitment to peaceful resistance. But, man, the personal cost of that resistance was just staggering. The junta told her multiple times, they said, "You are free to leave the country. You can fly back to your family in the UK today."
But it was a trap.
Exactly. She knew the mechanism of her exile. If she left, the military would instantly revoke her passport and never let her back in. The entire democratic movement would lose its figurehead.
And that leads to one of the most just heartbreaking moments in the historical record we're looking at. In 1997, her husband, Michael Heiress, was diagnosed with terminal prostate cancer.
It's an incredibly grim situation. You have high-profile figures all over the world, the U.S. government, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, even Pope John Paul II, personally appealing to the Bernese military.
Just to get him a visa.
Right, just to grant Michael a visa so he could fly to Yangon and say goodbye to his wife.
And the junta refused.
Yeah.
They released this incredibly cynical statement claiming they didn't have the medical facilities to care for him in Myanmar, and they urged her to leave the country to go to him. But she made the agonizing choice to stay. Michael died on his 53rd birthday in 1999, and he hadn't seen his wife in over 3 years.
Yeah. And what's fascinating here is the sheer brutality of the psychological warfare the junta was waging. They knew they couldn't just assassinate her. She was too famous.
Like a global icon at that point?
A global icon, a Nobel laureate. If they killed her, she becomes a martyr, which would likely spark an armed, uncontrollable uprising that could actually topple them. So instead, they tried to break her spirit by weaponizing her own family. They forced her to choose between the political destiny of her country and her dying husband.
And she chose the country. Though it's definitely worth noting, she did survive actual physical attacks, too, like the 2003 DePayne massacre, where a government-sponsored mob attacked her motorcade. They were beating people, they killed at least 70 of her supporters, and she barely escaped.
It was incredibly violent.
And then you have these truly bizarre incidents that the junta used to keep her locked up. Like in 2009, this American man named John Yetta, who claimed he had a divine vision of her being assassinated.
Oh, this story is wild.
It is. He literally swims across Inya Lake to her house, completely uninvited. He sneaks onto her property and just stays there for 2 days because he's exhausted from the swim.
And the junta immediately capitalizes on this absolute absurdity. They arrest her for violating the terms of her house arrest just because a foreigner was on her property. They put her through a trial closed to the public and use this completely uninvited intrusion to extend her sentence.
Which perfectly timed out to keep her locked away during the 2010 election.
Exactly. It was incredibly calculated.
It's maddening to read about. But throughout all of this, her commitment to nonviolence is what the world really focused on. Like, Time magazine called her one of the children of Gandhi. But here's where it gets really interesting. If you dig into the sources, she actually chose nonviolence not just for purely moral, saintly reasons, but as an expedient, highly practical political tactic. She explicitly said in 2007, "I do not hold to nonviolence for moral reasons, but for political and practical reasons."
Yeah, that quote is the master key to understanding her later actions. The world insisted on seeing her as this living saint. but she saw herself as a pragmatic politician. She understood the actual mechanics of power in Myanmar.
An armed uprising would have been crushed.
Utterly crushed. Taking up arms against one of the most heavily armed and ruthless militaries in Asia, it would be a bloodbath. The opposition would be wiped out, and the military would have the perfect justification for their violence. Nonviolence was the only strategic path that stripped the military of their excuses and kept international pressure on them.
So her strategy works, at least globally. The sanctions from the international community become too heavy for the military to bear. They become overly reliant on neighboring powers, and they realize they have to, open up the country's economy. But they aren't just going to hand her the keys to the country. They build a trap.
A very elaborate trap. In November 2010, she was finally released from house arrest. The military initiated this transition toward a partial democracy, basically to get those economic sanctions lifted. By 2015, her party, the NLD, competed in a general election and won a massive, sweeping victory, taking 86% of the seats.
But the military totally saw this coming. Years earlier, in 2008, before they let go of absolute power, they wrote a new constitution. And I love this analogy we were discussing earlier. It's like the military agreed to play a game of Monopoly with her, but they wrote a rule beforehand, stating they automatically own Park Place and Boardwalk, and oh, you aren't allowed to roll the dice.
That's exactly what it was like.
They included a very specific clause stating that anyone with a foreign spouse or children who are foreign citizens is permanently barred from becoming president.
It was a legal sniper rifle aimed directly at one person, Aung San Suu Kyi. Her late husband was British, and her 2 sons hold British citizenship. They wrote the rule just for her.
So she and her party engineer a workaround. They established a brand new position for her called state counselor. It essentially made her the de facto leader, acting a lot like a prime minister, while a loyalist from her own party officially held the title of president. But even with this workaround, she's trying to drive the car while the military is sitting in the passenger seat with their hand firmly gripping the emergency brake. I mean, how much power does she actually have?
Very, very little absolute power. It was an incredibly precarious power-sharing dynamic. To really understand this, look at the mechanics of that 2008 Constitution. The military automatically retained 25% of the seats in Parliament.
Without even having to win an election.
Right, unelected. And because constitutional changes required more than a 75% majority, the military essentially granted themselves an automatic, permanent veto over any structural changes to the country. On top of that, they kept complete control of the most crucial government ministries: defense, home affairs, and border affairs.
So she was walking a razor-thin tightrope.
Exactly. She had to govern, try to reform the economy, and manage a deeply fractured nation, all without giving the military any excuse to declare an emergency and stage another coup.
And it was exactly this delicate, honestly nearly impossible compromise with the military that led to the darkest chapter of her legacy. A chapter that completely shattered her international image as a human rights icon. We have to look at the Rohingya crisis.
Right. So in 2017, an insurgent group called the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, or RSO, launched attacks on police posts in Rakhine State. In response to that, the Myanmar military launched a massive, entirely disproportionate clearance campaign against the Rohingya, who are a heavily persecuted Muslim minority in the country.
And the ensuing violence was just horrific.
It involved mass killings, arson, and systemic abuse, driving hundreds of thousands of Rohingya refugees across the border into Bangladesh.
The United Nations and numerous international bodies widely describe the military's actions as a textbook example of genocide. State crime experts publicly warned that Aung San Suu Kyi was legitimizing genocide, and the international community, the exact same people and organizations who had spent 3 decades campaigning for her release, they looked to her to stop it, or at the very least, use her moral authority to condemn the military.
But instead of condemning them, she remained largely silent. And later, she actively defended their actions. She reportedly asked the newly appointed U.S. ambassador not even to use the word Rohingya because the government didn't recognize them as an official ethnic group, referring to them instead as illegal immigrants. She told the BBC that violence was being committed by both sides.
And it all culminated in a really surreal moment in December 2019. She actually traveled to the International Court of Justice at The Hague to personally defend the Myanmar military against allegations of genocide. Just think about that image. In a speech of over 3,000 words, she never once used the term Rohingya. She called the genocide allegations incomplete and misleading, and framed the military's actions purely as an internal armed conflict responding to terrorist attacks by RSA.
She even questioned how there could be genocidal intent if the government had opened its own domestic investigations.
Which is wild, because the international community viewed those domestic investigations as entirely insincere, particularly because the government had actively prevented UN investigators from visiting the affected areas. Furthermore, under her leadership, freedom of the press severely deteriorated. Like, 2 Reuters journalists uncovered concrete evidence of a massacre of Rohingya civilians at a village called Indin. And for doing their jobs, they were arrested under the colonial-era Official Secrets Act.
Right. A police officer even testified in court that the journalists were framed using entrapment.
Yeah. Yet Aung San Suu Kyi defended their prosecution. She publicly challenged critics to point out where there was a miscarriage of justice in the legal process.
It's just...
I find myself really struggling to process this pivot. The international backlash was absolute. Amnesty International revoked her Ambassador of Conscience Award. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum revoked her Elie Wiesel Award. She was stripped of honorary citizenships from Canada and Freedom of the City Awards from Oxford, Dublin, and Edinburgh. The very people who made her a global icon just tore down her banners. So, was this a calculated, cold political maneuver to appease her voting base? Or had she actually convinced herself the military's narrative was true?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it illustrates the deeply uncomfortable realities of Myanmar's internal politics. You really have to understand the demographics. Myanmar has over 100 ethnic groups, but the dominant group is the ethnic Bamar majority, who are predominantly Buddhist. Suu Kyi is Bamar. The military leadership is Bamar. Historically, there has been deep, complex friction between the Bamar majority and various ethnic minority groups.
So her political base, like the people who actually vote for her in overwhelming numbers, are the Bamar majority, who largely supported the military's actions against the Rohingya.
Precisely. Some analysts and our sources suggest her defense was a heavily calculated move to retain the support of that Bamar majority, especially with the 2020 elections approaching. Because if she condemned the military, she would essentially alienate her own voters.
Right.
Other analysts suggest she was treading carefully to avoid provoking the military into a coup, just trying to protect the very fragile democratic transition. But, regardless of her internal motivations, the outcome is exactly the same. She prioritized domestic political survival and her precarious power-sharing agreement over the international moral approval she had enjoyed for decades.
She stepped completely out of the realm of the idealized dissident and fully into the realm of a compromised politician. But despite her shocking willingness to defend the military on the world stage, that alliance was just a mirage. Ultimately, the military turned on her anyway.
They did. In November 2020, her party, the NLD, won another general election by an even larger margin than before. The military, seeing their political proxy party completely decimated, claimed the election was marred by widespread fraud.
Despite independent observers validating the results.
Exactly. The observer said it was valid, but on February 1st, 2021, the military staged a full coup d'etat. They completely seized power, dissolved the government, and arrested Aung San Suu Kyi.
And the mechanism they used to arrest her is just classic authoritarianism. The charges they brought against her are almost comical in their obscurity. They needed a reason to hold her immediately, so the very first charge was illegally importing 10 walkie-talkies found at her residence.
Walkie-talkies?
Yeah, walkie-talkies. And from there, once they had her in custody, the charges just ballooned. They charged her with violating COVID-19 protocols during the election, incitement to sedition, violating the Official Secrets Act, and eventually they tacked on multiple counts of corruption.
And she was subjected to a series of secret trials inside a prison compound. These proceedings were completely closed to the public, the media, and international observers. Her lawyers were issued strict gag orders. Human Rights Watch accurately described it as a courtroom circus of secret proceedings on bogus charges. And by the end of 2022, she was convicted on a multitude of charges and sentenced to a staggering total of 33 years in prison.
And keep in mind, she's in her late 70s at this point.
Right.
The sources give us updates tracking her condition all the way through early 2026. She was moved from house arrest into solitary confinement in a specially built area inside a prison in Naypyidaw. Her health severely deteriorated. Her younger son, Kim, reported she was suffering from severe toothaches, unable to eat, and dealing with a worsening heart condition.
And requests for outside medical assistance were allegedly denied by the junta.
Right. Though there have been slight tactical shifts from the junta recently, haven't there?
There have. During a massive heat wave in April 2024, she was temporarily transferred to house arrest as a health measure. And then, as part of a general wave of amnesties during the Burmese New Year in April 2026, the military government reduced her sentence to 18 years and 9 months, committing her to house arrest at a designated residence. State media even broadcast a photo of her for the first time in years, which was likely just a minor concession to international pressure.
So what does this all mean? I mean, looking at the sheer whiplash of her timeline. She sacrificed her family, she sacrificed her global halo to defend her captors, and she still ended up right back where she started, locked away by the very same junta. It's almost physically painful to trace that circle.
It is the ultimate political tragedy. She stepped down from the moral high ground to try and navigate the reality of governing a state that was deeply fractured, with a military that never truly gave up its monopoly on force. She tried to play their game within their rigged rules, and she lost. Her party is dissolved, her international allies are entirely alienated, and she is once again cut off from the world, ending her political career exactly the way it began in 1989.
It's an unbelievable journey. From a quiet academic in Oxford to a revered democracy icon and Nobel laureate, then to a compromised political leader, then an international pariah defending the indefensible, and finally, back to a silenced political prisoner.
It really forces us to examine our own expectations as observers, you know? We love stories with clear heroes and clear villains. It makes the world easy to digest. But real-world politics, especially in a country with the complex ethnic and military history of Myanmar, is incredibly messy. Aung San Suu Kyi's life is a stark, uncomfortable reminder of what happens when an idealized symbol has to step into the arena, make brutal compromises, and actually govern.
And that brings me back to where we started today. Think about the nature of the international community's hero worship. We desperately needed her to be a flawless savior. But when we project our own pristine ideals onto a flawed human being, operating in a complex, deeply divided country, who was really at fault when they inevitably failed to live up to our impossible standards,